So every day, the sights, sounds, triumphs, and failures, the memories of World War II are fading. The men and women who fought in World War II are in their 90s or older now. They are dying at a rate of 245 per day. And of the 16 million who served, there are fewer than 170,000 left alive today. To borrow a quote from Mr. Brokaw's original book, The Greatest Generation, they came of age during the Great Depression and World War II and went on to build modern America. Men and women whose everyday lives of duty, honor, achievement, and courage gave us the world we have today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's up to us to keep this history alive and to honor these veterans, to be their voice and to tell their story. I'm proud to give you The Greatest Generation Speaks.
Robert Weil and Jim Levy, two men of Alabama, were best friends when the Normandy invasion was launched. Weil wrote to describe his reaction and later visit to those beaches. He also included his friend's account of what he had gone through.
I have never had such a feeling of guilt as I had on the morning of June 6, 1944, when I awoke to learn that the invasion was on. I was a second lieutenant, still stationed stateside, but with my conscience over there. It was some months before I learned that my best friend had landed at Omaha Beach that morning at 8 hours. He is Jim Levy, then captain in the 81st Chemical Mortar Battalion of the 115th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division. Like many others, Jim never spoke to me about the invasion. And it was not until the 50th anniversary of the invasion that I read an account of it, which was published on the op-ed page of the Montgomery Advertiser. During the 90s, my wife and I visited Omaha Beach, the cemetery, and from one end of the beach to the other. As we drove down the beach, we saw a monument on the side of the hill, and we drove up to see what it was. I think it was a monument dedicated to the 29th Division. There was also an American couple with two children visiting the monument. As I stood there gazing at the profile of that long, steep hill, plunging down to that beach, which appeared so narrow now, I could not imagine how our troops could have ever landed there with all the obstacles and gunfire. I said to this American chap that I didn't see how our fellows could have survived there with the Germans looking right down their throats. And he said, yes, they sure would. I replied, you said that just like you were here. He said, I was here. What was your division? I wasn't really with the division. I was with the Chemical Mortar Warfare Battalion. Well, my best friend was with the Chemical Mortar Battalion, which was supposed to land several miles up the beach, but the tide brought them down to a different point. The same thing happened to us. Who was this friend of yours? His name is Jimmy Levy. You don't mean Captain H.F. Jim Levy? Well, it turned out Jimmy was his company commander, and he was one of the platoon leaders.
And this is a partial first-person account of what Jim Levy went through that day, June 6th, 1944.
As we began our run for the beach, features of the terrain became gradually more distinct, and flashes from our bombardment and air counterfire grew in intensity and visibility along with a tumult of sound. The early waves of engineers had been unable to make sufficient lanes through the obstacles, which were far more effective than had been innovated in training, and we were forced to move down the beach parallel to the shoreline, searching for a cleared lane to the beach. About this time, an LCVP barely nudged a landmine, which exploded, wounding a couple of men in the bow and causing the craft to take on water alarmingly. We got another of our LCVPs alongside, transferred all men and weapons, but shed our packs. Another of our LCVPs was hit by artillery, and a transfer of men and weapons was again affected some 1,000 yards offshore, with still another of Bravo Company's LCVPs. Eventually, we found a clear path to shore, and the craft moved in as far as possible before grounding on a sandbar. All of this time, my reactions were as if I was a spectator rather than an active participant. Apart from what was occurring, yet mechanically responding, it was as if the mind was overwhelmed by the enormity of all the external events, completely beyond our control, yet somehow functioning by rote. The sea became shoulder high on the beach side of the bar, and many men, overloaded with equipment, drowned. We had been scheduled as the fourth wave, behind the engineers and the first two waves of infantry, to touch shore at HR plus 10 minutes. But time seemed interminable and really at a standstill. Gradually, the number of men at the waterline, living, wounded, and dead, increased. Believing it was better to be killed inland than at water's edge, trickles of men moved up the steep face of the dune line. The leaders replaced by the next in line as they were killed or disabled by anti-personnel devices. Heroism was commonplace, but there was no alternative. It was easy to be selfless when there seems to be no self. We too eventually moved across what seemed an expansive beach and up the narrow tape-marked path off the beach, at times through uncleared minefields. We established a firing position on a shelf-like path some 20 feet below the rim of the dunes and within 100 yards of the front-line infantry. It later turned out that I was the only one of the 4 company commanders of the 81st who survived D-Day. Our position above the beach and below the top of the dune line was like a grandstand seat at a spectacle we would have preferred not to watch. We were reasonably sheltered from direct weapon fire, except for the few still occupied fortifications. I visited Normandy and Omaha Beach in late September 1987 for my first and only visit. It was a tremendously emotional experience and rekindled memories and feelings long dormant. I could determine within 100 yards of just where we had come ashore and set up. The faces, thoughts, sounds, happenings came flooding back. Many I did not want resurrected. We visited the American Cemetery, high on the Norman Hills overlooking Omaha Beach, in a more serene, appropriate, immaculate, and peaceful setting I cannot imagine. A memorial stands at the north end where you enter the cemetery, a semicircular colonnade in an arch, above which is inscribed, "These endured all and gave all, that justice among nations might prevail and that mankind might enjoy freedom and inherit peace." In the middle distance, dividing the long avenue of lawn, stands a small circular chapel, above which is inscribed, "This embattled shore, portal of freedom, is forever hallowed by the ideal, valor, sacrifices of our fellow countrymen." How long will these lessons be learned and remembered? Standing there in appreciation, sadness, and long postponed grief, I can only wonder, why not me?
Not all war stories are about combat, heroism, life, and death. Raymond Dahl described his final, never-to-be-forgotten days as a combat photographer and the last rescue of priceless artifacts from the personal collection of Ludwig von Beethoven.
I was 19 in 1942 when I enlisted in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. I served in the Army as a motion picture combat cameraman. following a semester study at the University of Southern California's Department of Cinema. I was armed with a .45 revolver, and it was my job to shoot the shooter with a government-issued 12-pound 35mm IMO movie camera. We were assigned to fighting units in the European theater of operations, mainly ground forces of infantry divisions. In one armored attack at about the time of the Battle of the Bulge, I was wounded as 300 German prisoners of war were rounded up after a long tank battle. I got in the way of German artillery as I walked alongside our Sherman tanks and was whacked by an 88 shell that pierced my helmet as I bent over to reload my camera. I returned to combat 2 days later, along with scores of GIs also hit in that same German barrage. Oh, there is nothing like a close call on a battlefield to make the morning more beautiful, to make the green fields more fragrant, to make life seem like a worthwhile journey. There's so many experiences your book has awakened in me. So many memories good and some not so good. At the time, a Graves registration unit, GI, called me over as he processed identification of dead German soldiers lying in the fields after a firefight. He handed me a small photograph taken from the wallet of one young soldier. It was a picture of Ginger Rogers, who's my favorite movie star too. As the Allied armies had driven further into Germany and the German High Command could see that the end of the war was near, Field Marshal Hermann Goering, Commandant of the German Luftwaffe, who was infamous for his looting of Europe's artistic treasures, issued orders to all the German museums that they were to disperse their collections so that they would not be looted and pillaged by invading armies. One of these historical sites was the Beethoven House in Bonn. This was his birthplace and the home of the composer, and had been converted into a museum. It was known that the museum's collection included 3 pianos owned by Beethoven, some musical instruments, and oil portraits important to him in his life, including Joseph Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, and others. Just months before, German supply trucks had appeared at the museum's entrance, where its treasures were quickly loaded, and the convoy, led by Dr. Wildemann, the museum's curator, traveled to various rural sites in the Rhineland province. We took back roads. It would always be a long journey to avoid the main highways that were littered with the ruins of destroyed tanks and abandoned equipment left by the Germans. But what we dreaded most were the landmines put in place by the retreating enemy. I thought to myself that if this journey had taken place just a few days before, we might have taken enemy fire. As we drove through small villages, it was obvious that some Germans were afraid to come out of their houses. They weren't certain that the war had actually ended. But some villages had white claws of surrender hanging from windows or on poles. The children were the bravest, coming out of their houses into the streets to point homemade toy guns at us. For the bulk of the population in these rural areas could not accept that their country had actually capitulated. I caught these scenes in my camera's viewfinder as we approached each site on Wildemann's list of hiding places for the museum's treasures. I would jump out of the truck's cab, and as doors hesitantly opened, I could see faces of fear, the occupants not knowing what fate awaited them. Until Wildemann smiled reassuringly, speaking rapidly, and my camera harmlessly. Then out would come the crates and the trunks. Oh, and from Hamburg Castle, the 3 pianos, which had been stored in the castle's dungeon. Finally, we were led to the Siegen salt mines, where the precious artworks and boxes of musical manuscripts had been stored, because the salt deposits took the moisture out of the air, leaving temperatures and humidity virtually constant. Now, at the end of our quest, Dr. Wildemann asked me to hand carry a huge bundle of autographed music manuscripts, the originals, and so priceless. The manuscripts for the piano sonatas were present, including the Moonlight Sonata and the scores for the Pastoral and the Ninth Symphonies. We finally reached Bonn, which was like a ghost town with blocks and blocks of incendiary ruins. We turned down a street at Wilhelm Signal with a sign that read, Beethoven Haus Gasse, Beethoven House Street. We came to a stop before a large boarded up portal, and the first thing I noticed were the German words, Eintritt verboten, Museum. Entry forbidden, museum. In filming inside and outside the museum, I was shown by the caretaker the room upstairs where Beethoven was born in 1770. One question we all asked ourselves that had to be answered. How was it possible that this little 200-year-old tinderbox of a building had survived the severe and prolonged incendiary bombing? German caretaker's story was one of the most amazing to come out of the war. He told us, translated by Dr. Wilderman, that each night as the incendiary bombs began to fall, he would crawl up to the roof of the building with a garden hose turned on with as much pressure as it would afford, and spray, douse the roof and the walls all night long until the bombing ceased, keeping the wood and the plaster as wet as possible so that the structure might survive another night. What a day it had been. A unique and gratifying experience for us all, and I felt that somehow I had contributed to the making of peace in Europe. I guess it has to be my best remembered story, and one not about fighting, but about the mutual respect for one of mankind's most admirable accomplishments, great music. When I look back on that day in Bonn, it had provided a moment of sanity in the hectic demise of the Third Reich. And the experience proved that the only glory in war is in the hope of cooperation between the enemies afterwards. The Beethoven House, conquerors and the conquered, had joined hands to preserve mankind's heritage and culture.
Veronica Mackey Hulick of Fort Pierce, Florida, became a Navy wave during World War II and before long found herself assigned to a secret project. At first she didn't know what she was working on, but later discovered it was a critical part of the Allied success.
I was 20 years old when I joined the Navy Waves in January of 1943. After boot camp, I was sent with a contingent to Dayton, Ohio. We were assigned to a building across from the National Cash Register Company. We sat at a long table with a soldering iron, long threads of solder, and inch-long wires of red, yellow, blue, and green. We were given a small wheel with a graph to follow. We soldered those little wires inside the wheel according to the graph. And then the wheel was covered with graphite because plastics hadn't been invented yet. I decided I must not pass the aptitude test. This had to be the dumbest job in the Navy. However, I was surrounded by many bright young women, many of whom, like me, were former telephone operators. One day my mother called to say that a Navy officer was going all around my hometown, Wilmington, Delaware, asking questions about me. He went to my teachers, friends, employers, and neighbors. I didn't know what was going on. But I began to feel kind of important. Now, we worked the swing shift and had 1 day off a week. The third week, we got 2 days off. It took 3 months to get a Saturday and Sunday off, and we were constantly monitored by wave officers and had many sessions on security about our work. This went on from April to October. One day I went on duty and saw something huge on a flat car near our building. It was covered with a gray shroud, and I said to myself, I wonder what that is. I now know it was the housing for a computer that was being built. NCR built the housing, the switches, and the wiring, and we women wired the rotor wheels. That day, we also learned we were being transferred to Washington, D.C. We were assigned to barracks across from the Naval Communication Annex at Nebraska and Massachusetts Avenue. And when we went on duty, we had to show a picture and number ID to 2 armed Marines at the gates and a Navy man at our building. The first day we went on duty, we were taken into a chapel, and a Navy officer stood in the pulpit, and told us if we talked about what we were working on at this station, we would be shot. Yes, shot. About 500 women ran these 120 computers on a shift. It was constant for 2 years. We never breached security. We had gotten the message loud and clear. Now, the computer was nicknamed the bomb because of the noise it made when it was running. The word computer wasn't even in the vocabulary at the time. Also missing in those times was air conditioning. The oppressive heat of DC summers was unbelievable, but we were young and full of patriotism. We lived in 2-story barracks, had 50 girls on each floor. We had a bunk, a locker, community showers. We all got along, worked hard, and had fun on our days off. Now, when we got a printout from the computer, we couldn't read it. We tore it off quickly, ran to the door at the end of the room and knocked, and this hand came out and took it. We presumed to have been coding room. We had 120 computers, and when we revved them up, we got 1 trillion combinations. Hitler once sent a message to a general, and we intercepted and broke it before it reached the general. You know, it still boggles my mind in retrospect that first we helped to build this computer and then we ran it. We were paid $50 a month for a long time because the Navy didn't know what to call us. We weren't radio men or yeomen. Finally, after a year and a half, we were given a new rating, Q, and raised to $60 a month. Now, when the war was over and we were being discharged, we were taken individually into an office, told to put one hand on a Bible and take an oath that we would never talk about our work. We had formed for future employers saying they were not to ask us about our activities during World War II. 500 women went home, got on with their lives, and never said a word. In 1977, some 30 years later, President Carter declassified a lot of World War II materials, and a couple of books were written about the bomb. The Navy never informed any of these women that each oath had been lifted. My parents died, never knowing what I did in the service. However, in 1994, we had a reunion in Dayton, Ohio, and about 80 women showed up. A Navy historian spoke to us and told us that we were responsible for the sinking of between 750 and 800 German U-boats, that we had shortened the war by 1 and possibly 2 years, and we had saved countless lives. It was great being able to tell my children and grandchildren of my work during World War II. I just wept. For those who passed away and never revealed their contributions to the war effort. You're right, Mr. Rohal. This was a different time in our history. We were patriotic, disciplined, caring, and just so thrilled to know that we had done something special to help end the war. We never sought recognition. I always thought of us as the unsung heroines of World War II.
Van Parker of Carmichael, California was a veteran B-29 pilot when the war ended. He shared with us a letter that he wrote to his parents about his final mission.
September 3rd, 1945. Dear folks, yesterday I experienced a privilege which will long live in my memory. It was my honor to lead a B-29 squadron over the Tokyo area as Japan's final surrender was in progress. The purpose for our visit to the Japanese Empire was to take part in the greatest display of aerial power ever assembled. This for the benefit of the Japanese people. What a sight. There were seemingly thousands of our airplanes in the sky. Everywhere you looked, there was a large formation of aircraft. The display must have struck awe and terror into the hearts of all Japanese that witnessed the spectacle. We gave them a never-to-be-forgotten show of the aerial might that brought them to their knees. As we flew low over Tokyo Bay and our big battle wagon Missouri, where the Japanese were signing the historical peace documents that officially ended this world's bloodiest conflict, I couldn't help but feel proud that I played a small part in our victory. Stretched before our eyes and crowding the very shores of Tokyo Bay were hundreds of ships. I had never seen such a display of naval power. All of it ours. Our Army and our Navy were everywhere. After the bomber formation breakup and before returning to our home base, our crew seized the opportunity to do a little personal reconnoitering of the Japanese homeland. We were particularly interested in Tokyo and the environs. It was the first time we'd flown over Japan without being shot up. Because we were flying so low and because there were no guns firing at us, I was able to view without distraction the terrible devastation brought upon Tokyo by our B-29s. Never in your wildest dreams could you visualize such destruction. There were no houses left standing. Tokyo was a mass of strewn rubble and ashes. Few people wandered the deserted streets. The city had the eerie appearance of being a vast ghost town. In fact, the city of Tokyo was no more. Words of description failed me. You had to view this nightmarish sight with your own eyes to believe that such destruction could be. And not just Tokyo, but every city where our B-29s paid a visit. In stark contrast to the ruins of the great cities was the green countryside, the rolling terraced hills, the valleys, the rice paddies, and the quaint houses with their upturned corners. Always before in my letters I described the Japanese homeland as drab, colorless, and foreboding. And perhaps that description was forthcoming because I was always such an unwelcome visitor there. One is not apt to get the proper perspective when you're looking down the barrels of unfriendly guns firing flak at you. At such times, no, you're definitely not interested in the color and view of the terrain below. But in truth, the country of Japan is a thing of rare beauty when viewed from the sky. Only the eyesores of those burned out cities ruin the landscape. Thank God this terrible conflict has been terminated. And now that the war is officially over, it will not be long before I'll be headed back to the United States. Happy day. Yesterday's show of power mission was credited as combat to all who participated. So I now have 32 combat missions over Japan and accrued well over 100 points toward my rotation. That record should be enough to ensure an early return. Love, Van.
Every generation has a collective memory, a shared experience. But the men and women who went through the Great Depression and World War II were unique in that the events of their lifetime were so inclusive. Children of the 60s may identify with Woodstock or the Chicago 7, with sex and rock and roll. But what about the others who went to Vietnam or voted for Richard Nixon. For that generation, the memory screen is divided. But for the greatest generation, it's a family portrait. Those bonds take on many forms. Some of them are haunting and painful. Gregory Kirschner of Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, wrote to share a story he has carried with him ever since the war and to ask for help. Kirschner served as a medic with the 76th Infantry Division and has tried for more than 50 years to locate the wife of a soldier he treated on the battlefield. After the war, Kirschner worked for the Postal Service for 36 years. He raised 10 children, 9 of whom are college graduates.
I consider myself fortunate to have survived. When an infantry company went into battle, 3 medics such as myself were assigned to it. I outlived the first 2 men assigned with me, the Company I, the 417th Infantry Regiment, 76th Infantry Division. I also outlived 8 replacement medics. When I was promoted, another man took my place. He was killed the following morning. I've tried without success for over 50 years to locate the family of a man that I treated on the battlefield. This man, one of 5, who lost all or part of a leg in a minefield, lost a leg at the hip. This happened as I treated him. He said to me, God, what will my wife say? There he was almost blown in half. She's being followed. This happened at night in a rainfall. I always wanted to tell his wife that he was thinking of her. This interest has been renewed by the scope of your research. This man, Glenn Jones, all I know is he was from one of the southern states, had received a letter 3 days before from his wife, saying to him that she was on her way to the hospital for their first child. He said, I hope she'll be all right. Died in an ambulance on his way to the field hospital.
With the invaluable help of the Veterans Administration, we found Sergeant Jones' widow, Virginia, living in a rural area of western North Carolina. She had moved there from Winston-Salem to be with her parents and to have her child after Glenn Jones was killed. She never remarried. Virginia said that she was surprised to hear of Kirschner's letter since she had never met anyone who had served with her husband. And she agreed to speak with him on the telephone, but asked that he not include any gory details, explaining that even after 54 years, the hurt is still there. I arranged for Kirschner to call on an autumn Sunday afternoon, and he and Virginia talked for an hour. He said he was thrilled to have lived so long as to have finally found her. He told Virginia that he was not only her husband's medic, but also his friend, and he recalled their being on the move and receiving mail from home. We were reading our letters, and Glenn said, well, by now my wife should be entering the hospital to have our first baby. He also told her how Glenn repeatedly worried about her welfare as he was being treated for his fatal wounds. As for Virginia, well, she said their conversation was almost like getting a message from Glenn. She was particularly pleased that her grandson, who was a history buff, will now be able to read something of a grandfather he never knew. Virginia said that when her husband was killed, they had been married for 10 months and 10 days. Glenn Jr. arrived 2 months later. She said her husband would have been proud to know that he had a son carrying on his name, and although it was difficult at first for her to call her son Glenn, after a while she was glad that she named him for his father. Glenn Jr., 54, is an engineer with the International Paper Company in Wilmington, North Carolina. He was raised by his mother, his grandparents, and his uncles. A few years ago, Virginia gave him a shadow box containing his father's medals from the war. Gregory Kirschner also told Virginia Jones and another friend of Glenn's, Andrew Patrick of Ohio, who had been wounded at the same time but returned home alive with part of his leg missing. He said he would put them in touch as well. 54 years after that terrible night in the dark and the rain of the Battle of the Bulge, when Sergeant Glenn Jones was mortally wounded, his wife now knows his final thoughts were of her. W.E. Bilderback Jr. of Fort Worth, Texas, a businessman who deals in construction supplies and equipment, wrote to us about a letter that was taken from a dead Japanese soldier at Iwo Jima. Reading a translation of that letter 50 years later helped to change his views about the Japanese.
During World War II, I was a first lieutenant in anti-aircraft artillery. I made the invasion of Iwo Jima along with the Marine Corps. One night at Iwo Jima, a lot of Japanese soldiers were killed. The next morning, one of my sergeants came to me and said he had taken a letter off of one of the dead soldiers and asked me if I'd like to have it. I said, yes, I would. 50 years later, on a trip to Maui, I finally had the letter translated by a young woman at the Kapalua Bay Hotel. When my wife read that letter to me, I cried. That letter could have been written to me by my own wife. I detested the Japanese at the time that letter was written because I'd been taken away from my new bride and a promising career. But that letter made me realize the dead soldier didn't want to be at Iwo Jima either. The young woman who translated the letter became so emotional, she cried. She asked me if she might keep the letter and try to locate the Japanese wife. A year later, the widow was found and presented with the letter.
And this is the letter to Mr. William Bilderback from the Japanese soldier's wife, Yoshi Sakuma.
I'd like to express my sincere appreciation for your and Miss Eggy's, that's the translator, recent efforts on my behalf. I received a letter of memento written to my late husband in the presence of the mayor of Fuhiki Town and officials from the Fukushima Prefectural Government and Fuhiki Town.
Though Mr. William Bilderback doesn't understand Japanese, he kept that letter that was entrusted to him during the Second World War over 50 years ago.
I truly feel this letter reminds us that all people living on earth can be united as one, despite the conflicts they have endured throughout history. I read the letter again and again and felt my husband had finally come back to us after 51 years. I was flooded with 1,000 emotions and tears. As soon as I received the letter, I visited his grave to tell him of this matter. Before the war, I lived with my late husband and 2 daughters happily in the vicinity of the Joban coal mine. However, he was called into the army and fell in the Battle of Iwo Jima Island. I was at my wit's end and I came back to my parents' home with my daughters. However, my youngest daughter passed away due to illness shortly thereafter. I started work as a laborer, but we earned a precarious living. I remarried and lived with my second husband and my daughter's family and my 2 granddaughters for a while. And now my 2 granddaughters have married and I am blessed with 4 great-grandchildren. I am 80 years old now and I enjoy practicing gate ball every day for the gate ball competitions held 3 times annually. Live happily on a small old age pension provided by the National Pension System in Japan. I believe that your and Miss Yuriko Eggy's thoughtfulness, which transcends national boundaries, will continue to build stronger ties of friendship, and this will be passed down for posterity from generation to generation. Please take care of yourselves and I wish you a peaceful life.
Mr. Bilderbeck also sent a copy of a letter written by Mrs. Sakuma to her husband while he was a soldier on Iwo Jima. It's been a long time. I hope you are fine as usual. When you left home, it was a cold day with white clouds, but now spring has come and it's already in the month of May with fresh green leaves. How fast the time flies. I am fine too, protecting family back here. Noriko is fine. She's growing up without catching any cold or flu. Every morning when I say a prayer for you, Noriko also imitates me to pray with her little hands together. I think of you often and I pray for you a lot. When I ask Noriko where her father is, she answers, "Banzai," with both her arms up in the air. Even though she is little, she does not forget. Goodbye from your wife. Lorraine Davis was born in 1926, so her earliest memories are of the Great Depression. As she says, "I didn't know life wasn't supposed to be poor." Older siblings remember better times. By the time Lorraine was in high school, the war was on and her life took another turn. She begins by describing a bus trip she took to Salt Lake City shortly after graduating.
I sat with a former classmate who had been home on leave and was going back to Salt Lake to be sent overseas with the Marines. We talked about many things, but not his future. Suddenly, an 18-year-old girl matured several years. Now, I want to tell you about the girls who were left behind. Some girls married, and they were left alone. The rest of us were left alone too, since all the young men were in the service. We started to meet every week or two for companionship and support. We talked about husbands and boyfriends and the war. Every day was much the same. We were all expected to get a job to help the war effort. Many worked in munitions plants or other war-related industries. Some were even Rosie the Riveter. I started to work at the USDA a few days after graduation. Every day was about the same. So we'd come home from work and listen to the evening news or see it on the newsreels at the movies. Many letters were written to places all over the world. I corresponded with many young men in every part of the world, since I did not have anyone special. I saved the letters for a few years, and finally discarded them. Now I wish I had not. This same group of girls are still meeting after 55 years. After the war, boyfriends and husbands came home. The rest of us got married. Soon we were all having those baby boomers. Pretty soon they were going to school, enjoying high school activities, getting married, having families of their own, even grandchildren. And all this time, the girls were still meeting every month, supporting each other, caring for each other, becoming even closer. At first, we called ourselves the Club of 44. We later changed the name to Amity, because we were such good friends. Some have passed, but we still have close to 25 members. The only prerequisite for membership was to have been a member of the class of 1944. Amity is a consequence of World War II.
Ann Black, now a corporate executive in Washington, D.C., was born after her father was killed in the closing months of the war. She writes eloquently of the effect on her mother, her own childhood, and their later years together.
My parents, Seal and Ed Maloney, had been childhood friends growing up in Englewood, New Jersey. They fell in love in their 20s, but because of the Depression, postponed their wedding until their early 30s. The coming war propelled them into action. The 4 years of my parents' marriage, they lived with my maternal grandmother in Englewood. My father enlisted early on in the war. He was an MP in the docks of New York. In January 1945, with the end of the war in sight and my mother 4 months pregnant, my father, at the ancient age of 34, was called overseas as part of the mop-up effort as the Allies moved across Europe. He was a sergeant in the 173rd Infantry Regiment, 69th Infantry Division. On April 14th, he was killed in action in Aachen, Germany. One of his buddies wrote, "We were attacking an AA position when the 88s opened up on us. We were pretty far out from the town when we got the orders to withdraw. And was at least 300 to 500 yards out front. On my way back, I noticed a medic working on one of our boys, but with the 88 still coming, I didn't stop to look. When the medics returned, they said it was Ed who had got it. They said he never knew what hit him. 6 weeks later, while the rest of the world was rejoicing at the end of the war in Europe, I was born in New York. About to leave the hospital, my mother wrote the following to her brother. "I am sorry I have neglected to write you lately, but I have lost whatever pep I ever had. The baby arrived on May 26th, and I hope this kid has been born under a luckier star than Ed and I were." She weighed 9 pounds, 8 ounces. So I did pretty good for an old dame. Mother is so nervous lately that she can't keep her hands still. I guess I can't blame her with all the weeping, but I can't help it. I miss Ed so much, and I don't know what I'm ever gonna do, and I can't find much reason for breathing. Everybody says that now that I have the baby, that I'll feel better, but they don't know what they're talking about. My mother had lost everything that she'd been waiting for. She lost her dreams. There was an awful lot of perfect linen tablecloths in our house that never got used. So many things being saved for a future that wasn't to be. And then there was me, born in the wake of my father's death, yet ready for life. I grew up with my mother and my grandmother in an ongoing parade of cats and dogs. I had a loving, stable childhood. I was close to my aunt and uncle, and I had fun with my many cousins. I was also very close with my father's family, his brothers, aunts, and uncles, and my one cousin. And then there were my father's many friends and war buddies who tried to keep in touch with my mother over the years as best they could. Sometimes just dropping into her office to say hi and to see how things were going. Growing up, I always felt that everyone came from perfect families made up of a mother, father, and children. But for my mother and me, our family was just the two of us. And I always felt a strong need to protect her from unhappiness. On the subject of my father's death, there was, for the most part, silence. And this silence, for me, led to feelings of great shame. Shame that I did not have a father, shame that he'd been killed when everybody else came back, shame that we'd been left behind, shame that we were different. I was a freshman in college when President Kennedy was assassinated. His death was a turning point in my life because it initiated a mourning for my own father, something I hadn't done before. 3 years later, I went to Europe for the first time, and I made my way to my father's grave at the Netherlands-American Cemetery in Margotten, Holland. After all these years, we were finally in the same place at the same time. He really had existed. It was good to know who he was at long last. In 1992, while sitting at my kitchen table drinking a cup of coffee, I read in the Washington Post about a group of World War II orphans laying in wreath at Arlington Cemetery in honor of their father's sacrifices. I had only known one other person who lost their father in the war, and it was startling for me to read the interviews. People saying that how as children they thought that their father would return home having been held captive in some foreign country all these years, and how they never talked about their father's death. And a woman named Ann Nix, who said that when they were kids, her and her brother, when they said their prayers, "Our Father who art in heaven," they thought that meant their father. I sat and I cried my eyes. Well, the next day, with the help of the Post, I was able to contact Ann Nix and her wonderful organization, the American World War II Orphans Network, A1, and my life changed. Well, for the good. I met many people like me, and I've made many friends with whom World War II is now just part of the conversation, and the shame has mostly gone away, because now, at last, we finally talked about it, and sometimes even laughed about it. I am proud of my dad, and I'm proud of what he did. My dearest wish is that I could have held his hand, looked into his eyes, and heard his voice just once. That was not meant to be. My father left a legacy of love, good humor, courage, and standing up for what you believe in. Mother carried on without him, leading a productive life and working until she was 87 years old and retiring finally to live near me in Washington. At 90, she is with it, reads 2 papers daily, does some volunteer work, and is eager to explore all the sights the city has to offer. From time to time, she dreams of my father vividly.
For Geneva Shelton of Hawthorne, California, the trauma of losing her brother in the war has not faded. He was in Belgium, advancing on Germany in mid-December 1944.
So many words in your book reminded me of my brother, especially D-Day and Battle of the Bulge, as he was part of both. My brother, Ralph Stewart, was so very much like so many of your heroes. In his 20s and engaged to be married when the war became the master of his life. He was a gentle, sensitive soul with unbounded love for his mother and for our sister's little girl, who died after a brief illness at the tender age of 5. I could never imagine him manning a machine gun. So many thoughts of my brother were aroused as I read your book, including some rather remarkable ones. First, his Army serial number is imprinted on my mind. 180-358-32. Always ready for immediate recall. Then there was a time when I had an incredibly vivid dream. My sister and I were at a county fair among a closely packed crowd of people. Somewhere in the distance of that crowd, we saw our brother Ralph, the perfect likeness of him in his army uniform, as in a photograph that I have. My sister and I were anxiously discussing how we were going to be able to tell our mother that we had seen Ralph, who after all had not been a casualty of war. We were eagerly working our way through the mass of people so he would not disappear by the time we had a chance to reach him. But as it seems with dreams, the moment we were close enough to reach out to him, I awoke from the dream. Then there was a time many years later, about 40 years after Ralph's death, when I was the principal of an elementary school. Each morning I posted an information bulletin in the staff room. As I recall, on 2 occasions, the date which I typed was December 18, 1944, the date that my brother was killed in battle. I wasn't consciously thinking of him at the time, but that date, as well as his Army serial number, was indelibly printed on my mind. When my brother's remains arrived for reburial in his hometown of Morton, Texas, attached to the end of his casket were his dog tags. 180-358-32. I still have the flag that was draped over my brother's coffin and placed in my mother's hands at his reburial service on November 23rd, 1947.
Charles J. Leonard Jr. was a Marine rifleman on Okinawa in 1945. He now lives in Danville, California.
I enlisted in the Marines on Armistice Day, 1944. I trained at San Diego and Camp Pendleton, shipped out with 5,000 other 17 and 18-year-old Marines on the day after President Roosevelt died. We went to Guam for several weeks as the advance party for the thousands of Marines that will be needed for the invasion of Japan. However, a sudden need for Marines developed in early May 1945 because of the fierce fighting on Okinawa. 2,500 of us were placed aboard an APA, the Clinton. 5 days later, we were off Okinawa, dodging kamikazes. We unloaded into the mud, trudged up to the front lines, which resembled World War I. The Japanese had 70 miles of tunnels. The entire Japanese 32nd Army, 116,000 Japanese soldiers, was underground. We had to come at them from the front. We paid the price. My battalion, 2nd Battalion, 1st Regiment, arrived on Okinawa with 32 officers and 869 men. When the battle ended officers and 874 men had been killed or wounded. And those figures don't include the hundreds of Marines that were disabled by dysentery or malaria, or had their senses knocked out by the heaviest use of artillery and mortar fire by the Japanese anywhere in the Pacific. I was wounded on June 12th, 1945. War ended on December 15th, just as my hospital ship, the USS Repose, was entering San Francisco Bay. I shall never forget the dozens of buddies who fell beside me. Every Memorial Day, I get very emotional. Those of us that survived are so very lucky. And we are thankful. Semper Fi!
After being fired by President Harry Truman in 1951, General Douglas MacArthur gave a speech before Congress in which he famously said, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." Sadly, the veterans of World War II are now fading away at the rate of 30,000 a month. Mary Griffiths was married to an old soldier, a career Army officer. They were retired in Columbia, South Carolina, when he died.
Last night, my husband died as I held him in my arms and I told him, "I love you, and go home, soldier. Your mom and dad are waiting on you. Give our Faye a kiss. Wait for me. We'll join you soon. Wait for me." And with that, 2 big tears rolled down his cheeks. He hadn't opened his eyes for 2 days, but I knew then he heard me. He took his last breath and he left me. Tomorrow, I will pick up his remains and bring him home for the last time and take him to Beaufort, South Carolina National Cemetery for burial. It was his wish and mine to be cremated and then buried. He did not want any service. That is my wish too. Like so many of the accounts I have read in your book, he too had to be pulled out to talk about his experiences. He chose Army as his career. And when I said goodbye to him in 1941, I did not see him for 3 years and 8 months. His war was the Pacific War. Then he hit the Korean War again for 2 years. He wore 9 battle stripes on his sleeve and a combat infantry badge with a silver star. These were the only decorations that really counted to him, that he prized. He did receive numerous other decorations, though. The Army was our life for 24 years. I loved every moment of it, except for the separation of wars. I always recognized my husband, the Army, and the United States honorably wherever we were stationed. I guess the happiest time in his life was when he returned to Ohio for the 148th Regimental Reunion after 40 years or so. And he was reunited with the men who served under him when he was a captain in World War II. Putting this down has given me so much comfort to talk with you tonight.
John Craven of McLean, Virginia, was a military chaplain in 4 campaigns during World War II and 3 during the Korean War. His story came to us from an April 6, 1995 article in the Religious Herald, the Virginia Baptist Weekly. The author is Pam Perry.
Traumatized by mortar fire, the young Marine huddled outside of the military hospital, his body trembling, clenched into a fetal position. John the Baptist took his hand and began to pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. In a moment, the Marine composed himself enough to join the chaplain. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. As they finished the Lord's Prayer, the soldier began to relax. Craven, a Southern Baptist, is thought to have seen more combat than any living chaplain. He participated in 4 campaigns during World War II, including Iwo Jima and 3 during the Korean War. On the 50th anniversary of the Iwo Jima campaign, Craven reflected on his participation in that historic battle. Craven, known affectionately as John the Baptist by the 4th Marine Division, ministered to hundreds of wounded, dying, and scared men. I tried to visit the troops as often as I could to encourage them, to talk to them, he said. For the most part, the chaplain's role was helping attend to the wounded. Often all Craven could do for the wounded was to take some moistened gauze and wipe the volcanic ash from their eyes. 5 decades later, Craven returned to that island in the Pacific to participate in a dedication of a monument to the casualties on both sides. The Japanese and the American veterans sat on separate sides of the monument. After leading a prayer, Craven and a former Japanese captain who had become a Buddhist priest embraced, setting an example for the men. Later, Craven wrote, before leaving the beach and the spot where our command post had been, I photographed a small green plant with a small red bloom. For me, that represented the hopes and dreams of peace rising out of the blood-soaked sands of Iwo Jima. One of Craven's lasting memories is the time he spent in a foxhole with Catholic chaplain Henry Druffel. In a telephone conversation more than 50 years later, Craven shared that experience, shared by 2 men representing different expressions of Christian faith, linked them forever. Craven reaffirmed his impression in a letter. You always have some fear, though of course I'd been through 3 campaigns before, so I was pretty well ready for combat. But it was my first time in a foxhole with another chaplain. We were together about 45 days, we coordinated and knew what the other was doing. When we got back to Maui, we saw each other every day. But then I'd been overseas 18 months, so I came home. After the war, Druffel got out and went to Indiana to his order, and he taught school. He didn't have a regular church. He worked in this Catholic community as a priest. He was a really great guy, really wonderful. We communicated about once a year. He came to stay with us once at our home. But he's been dead at least 10 years now. He had a good sense of humor, but he was a very pleasant, devoted priest. He was out to serve the men and help them and minister to them in every way he could. A great individual.
Rabbi Judah Nadich was the first Jewish chaplain to serve in the European theater. He was summoned on the orders of General Dwight D. Eisenhower after a Jewish soldier was killed in a training accident, and there was a dispute over whether his body would be buried in a Jewish cemetery, as a local rabbi urged, or a military cemetery. Nadich became an important advisor to Eisenhower after the concentration camps were liberated. The camps led him to question his faith in God. But eventually, he became one of New York City's most important spiritual leaders as rabbi of the Park Avenue Synagogue for 30 years.
I enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor. At the time I was a rabbi in Chicago, And I thought, if rabbis shouldn't be in the war, then who should? We've been reading in the press about what was happening to the Jews. Of course, compared to what happened later, what happened in the beginning was very little. But still, it was very offensive that the windows of Jews were being smashed, they were boycotted and things like that. After I enlisted, I was ordered to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I served as the Jewish chaplain for the troops there. There were over 100,000 troops at Fort Bragg, including the 101st Airborne. I was then sent from Fort Bragg to Brooklyn, New York, where after a brief wait at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, I was put aboard a Dutch freighter with 14 or 15 officers. 3 days out from England, we were attacked by German submarines. We lost 3 ships, but we had some 50 ships altogether. It wasn't pleasant, especially when we were gathered in this little room aboard the ship, listening to the radio. We heard German radio too. We heard this woman, whoever she was, speaking very good English and saying that German submarines had sunk a good number of American ships coming to Europe, and they would continue attacking until every ship was sunk. She was boasting of German successes in order to boost the morale of the German people. After arrival in Liverpool, I was ordered to Northern Ireland, where our first troops had been stationed, and I remained there until the troops emptied out for the invasion of North Africa. I was then ordered to England, where I was stationed at the Brookwood Army Cemetery near Surrey. They held funerals 3 days a week at Brookwood Cemetery, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. But I told them they should not conduct Jewish burials on Saturdays. And so that gave me 5 days to travel throughout Scotland and England, visiting bases, meeting with Jewish troops and officers, and conducting services. After the invasion of Normandy in 1944 in June, I became very busy at Brookwood Cemetery. With the first landings, we were very busy burying men, sometimes 300 to 350 a day. I made certain that there was a Catholic chaplain and a Protestant chaplain present. The bulldozers would dig trenches, and the bodies were carefully prepared and carefully placed in the trenches. And after all the bodies were in the trenches, each of the 3 of us conducted his own religion's burial service. It was difficult emotionally, and that happened day after day. There was no burial site as yet in France, so that continued for quite a while. In August of 1944, I was ordered to Normandy. In the Army, you're supposed to help men of all faiths who come to you for counseling, if I happen to be the chaplain closest. Soldiers were much more open to faith in times of danger than people are generally. Attendance at services was always good. I have no doubt that having a deeper faith helped these soldiers to go on. We knew the business we were in. It wasn't child's play. We knew that a good number of the men were going to die. We just hoped that we weren't among them. Chaplains were being killed too. The only time, actually, I came close to death during the war was in Normandy. I was with the Catholic senior chaplain and his deputy, and I was seated in the front seat with the driver, and the more senior officers were in the rear. And we were going through woods, and I heard the crack of a rifle, and I felt a cold wave go right behind the back of my neck. And the officer said, "Wow, that bullet just missed you." In the summer of 1945, I was sent to Frankfurt, Germany, by order of General Eisenhower. When I arrived there, I was told I had a new job. I was to travel to the displaced person camps, the DP camps, and to meet with the Jewish survivors who had been liberated by the American army from the German concentration camps, and to learn what the needs of the survivors were, and report that to General Eisenhower. I was horrified by what I saw. No one ever told us there were concentration camps. In one of my first trips, I went to Dachau before it was cleaned up. I walked into this large room and I saw a lot of clothing hooks along the wall and a nice polite German sign saying, "Remove your clothes, place them on a hook, remember where your hook is so that you can get your clothes afterwards and proceed to the showers." I went into the supposed shower room, and to my horror, it was what I had been told about. It was a gas chamber. And I looked at the door through which I had just come, a heavy metal door, and I looked on the inside. It was covered from top to bottom with scratches. I knew at once what they were. They were made by people. After the gas had been dropped from above, they were desperate in their futile attempts to get out, scratching at the door. I was led into the next room, and there were 3 large furnaces. It was a crematorium. The bodies were carried from the gas chamber and shoveled into the furnaces. And I saw at the back of the room there were these large sacks, like potato sacks. And I went to see what was in them, and they were filled with what I had seen at the bottom of the furnaces, human ash. And each of the sacks was stamped fertilizer. The ash was to be used to fertilize German farms. I went to one of the sacks, rolled up my sleeve, and plunged my arm into it and rubbed the ash with my fingers in the palm of my hand so that I should never forget what I had seen there. As you can see, I have never forgotten. When I returned to the States, I did not know whether I could continue to serve as a rabbi. In my own mind, I was wrestling with the idea that, of course, occurs to every believer in God. How could a good God permit this to happen? Fortunately, I was asked to be a fundraiser, a speaker by the United Jewish Appeal, which sent me on a 6-month speaking tour in 40 states to meet with the Jewish communities in each state and to tell them what my eyes had seen and what I had done. Then, after 6 months, I was asked to go to South Africa to speak to the Jewish communities there for the same purpose. By that time, in my own mind, I resolved my difficulty. I simply said to myself, if I believe in God, I have difficulty. If I don't believe in God, I have more difficulties. There's no doubt that my war experience affected me as a rabbi. It made me see life whole, with its good and with its evil. It made me see how wonderful human beings can be, how heroic, and how evil.
The only Congressional Medal of Honor awarded to a chaplain went to Father Joseph O'Callahan, a professor at Holy Cross. His nephew and former naval officer, Jay O'Callahan, wrote this narrative about his uncle.
Just before World War II, two professors were arguing up at Holy Cross College. One of them was Joseph T. O'Callahan, a mathematics professor, and he was saying, I don't know, I love teaching, but I gotta leave. What are you talking about, Joe? I'm talking about the war. I'm talking about Hitler raging all over Europe. We're just about to go to war. 1 million kids are going to be involved. What am I doing safe in a classroom? If I were a chaplain, I could be of some kind of help to those kids. You're 36 years old, Joe. You got claustrophobia so bad you can barely stand under an umbrella. You got high blood pressure and poor eyesight. You're a priest and a professor of mathematics. Let somebody else comfort the kids, Joe. Somebody who could lend a hand during an emergency. 4 years later, you, Lieutenant Commander O'Callahan, are on an aircraft carrier, the USS Franklin. Big Ben, they call her. It's 7 in the morning, March 19th, 1945, and you're 50 miles off the coast of Japan. All eyes are nervously scanning the skies, worried that a Japanese plane is going to break through the air cover and drop a bomb. Just after 7 in the morning, a Japanese plane does break through. It flies 50 feet above the deck of the Franklin and drops 2 500-pound bombs. One bomb breaks through the flight deck, and then it breaks through the forecastle deck. And finally, it explodes in the hangar deck. In moments, the hangar deck is one massive flame. Everyone in the hangar deck is dead. 1,000 and 2,000-pound bombs loosened from the planes are rolling on the hangar deck, beginning to explode. Bombs and rockets are exploding at the rate of 1 per minute. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel are creating an inferno. Hundreds are already dead. Hundreds more are burned and wounded. And through the smoke, somebody yells, "Padre, Padre, flight deck forward!" So you, the Padre Joe O'Callahan, you work your way through the choking smoke up to the forward flight deck. You turn around and you see behind you 800 feet of the flight deck, a mountain of fire. The black smoke churns into a dark plume rising into the sky. You turn and see before you 100 feet of that flight deck, still clear of the flame. There are men lying and groaning all over that part of the deck. Even out in the air, the stench of burned flesh is terrible. You, the Padre, you run over, you kneel down, and you take a sailor's hand. "Padre," he says, "we're dead." The explosions are so loud, you can barely hear, but you know what he means. The ship has lost power. You're DIW, dead in the water. The Franklin is drifting towards Japan. There's fire, smoke, and confusion everywhere. You, the Padre, suddenly realize what's most important. Communication has broken down. There's terror everywhere. There's no leadership because nobody recognizes anybody, not in that smoke, not with faces smeared with it. You, the Padre, realize that everyone can recognize that white cross on your helmet. So you run down to the forecastle. There are 40 or 50 sailors there, standing there, not just in terror, they are in awe. The ship is blowing itself apart. The sailors gather around you as if you are a magnet, but you lead those men up to the flight deck and turn them into firefighting parties. Now on the Franklin that March 19th at 9:52 in the morning comes the biggest explosion of the whole day. The whole ship is rocked. One more explosion like that and the whole ship might go down. You, the captain, Les Garrett, you look down from the bridge and you see two enclosed gun turrets. There are flames all around those gun turrets. If the shells inside of those gun turrets explode, the whole ship could go down. You, the captain, look down and you see the Padre with a fire hose, leading a group of sailors right through those flames. He gets to that first gun turret and he opens the door. You, the Padre, you don't want to step into that gun turret. You've got claustrophobia and your flesh crawls with the thought of it. It's dark in there and you're going to get trapped, but you force your body in and the sailors follow. You reach down and you pick up a 5-inch shell and you hand it over to the sailor next to you who passes it down the line saying, "Padre, praise the Lord and dump the ammunition." The captain, Les Garrett, you look over to your XO commander, Joe Taylor, and you say, "Get a tow on this ship." It's impossible without power, but you're drifting. You're only 40 miles from the coast of Japan. There's an air war going on above you. The Japanese will sink you unless you're towed out of there. So you, the XO, you run down to the forecastle and you manage to gather 80 men. Now the USS Pittsburgh comes astern and hands over a huge cable. The men have got to take that cable and drag it along to the forecastle. It has a huge loop on its end, and that loop has to be placed over a great hook on the deck. That cable is 1/4 mile long. It weighs 30 tons. 80 men cannot do it, but they must. Now imagine you are Frank Verschoor, and you're on that cable. You're a steward's mate, 2nd class, and you're a black man. All by yourself, you start to sing slowly. And we're going to take this line and make a tow. Heave ho, it's time to get on home. Heave! One by one, the other black sailors join in the song. It's impossible, but you're beginning to move. Now you, the captain, Les Garrett, as you look down on that flaming, slanting deck, the ship is at a 13-degree list. You see a 500-pound bomb slithering along that slippery, flaming deck toward a hole. If it goes in that hole, it will explode in the forecastle where those men are working the tow line. You look back and you see 6 sailors run through the smoke and stop the rolling bomb. They manage to get the bomb and turn it on end. But even from up there, you can look down and you can see the men are shaking because the bomb is hot and it's about to explode. You see 2 officers run over and kneel down and try to defuse the bomb, but they can't because they're so nervous. Then you, the captain, Les Garrett, look down and you see the Padre. He runs over to the bomb and he stands right beside it. He folds his arms and everyone calms down and the bomb is diffused. On May 16, 1945, in the Brooklyn Navy shipyard, on the flight deck of the Franklin, awards are being presented. Klimkowitz, Morgan, for sure. You, the Padre, Joe O'Callahan, you're on that flight deck. You're just a little disappointed for your mother because she's just come aboard. And you know your name is not going to be called out today. You know your mother is going to say, well, I bet Joe did something. What you, Joe O'Callahan, don't know is that the moment your mother came aboard, Les Garris, the captain, he went over to her and said, Mrs. O'Callahan, I am not a religious man, but I watched your son back then, and I thought if fate could do this for a man, there must be something to it. Mrs. O'Callahan, your son is the bravest man I have ever seen.
January 23rd, 1946, at the White House, President Harry S. Truman awarded Commander Joseph T. O'Callahan the Congressional Medal of Honor.
It's right here.
When he attends the reunion of his World War II outfit, Marty Fritz of Northfield, Massachusetts, who has been a farmer for 50 years, can look back on a long life of poverty, hard work, and pride.
I was born May 22nd, 1922, the oldest of 6 children. My dad was working 6 days a week, $17. Memories of those depression years are still vivid in my mind. We lived near the railroad tracks over in the poor section of town. I attended Catholic school taught by the Sisters of St. Joseph. And those times have left me with fond memories of my formative years. When I got home from school, my mother would make me change clothes right through to the skin and put on old clothes. We had to save our good clothes for church and school. After which, I'd take pails and walk the railroad tracks, picking up the coal that fell off the coal cars heading north. I'd pick coal till dark. When I got home with the coal, I'd hear my younger brothers whining, "Mama, we're hungry." Ask my mother, "Ma, what's for supper?" She'd snap back, "Whipped pudding and air sauce." And then I'd find her crying. I felt so bad. When I was a freshman in high school, I made the acquaintance of a farmer who needed help on his farm. He told me he would pay me $15 a month. I thought my folks would let me go there, figuring that my share could go to my younger brothers and sisters. I had to get up at 4 a.m., work in the barn until 6:30, then run up to the house, change my clothes, eat my breakfast, and walk 2 miles to meet the school bus. After school, same walk back. I had to work in the barn again until 9 o'clock, and then to the woodshed to split. On Sundays, I walked 7 miles to go to church. When I got paid, I gave my mother $10. The $5 I had left, I bought paid for all my own clothes. I worked on that farm for 5 years. The last 6 months I was there, the farmer did not have the money to pay me. On the night of December 7th, 1941, I was lying on my bed, listening to music on the radio, when suddenly the music stopped.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
I did not even know where Pearl Harbor was. All night long, I listened to the reports coming in from across the Pacific. In view of the fact that I had not been paid in 6 months and the farmer owed me $90, I decided it was time for me to change course. So the next day, I asked the man I was working for, it would be all right if I could have the day off. I walked 7 miles to enlist in the U.S. Navy, and 6 weeks at the Naval Training Station at Newport, Rhode Island, I was assigned to the new battleship USS Massachusetts, where I served for 4 years. I will be forever grateful to have had the honor and the privilege of serving my beloved country in her hour of need. This day, I thank God for helping us win the war and the fine leaders we have, the Admiral, the generals, and all the fine young men and women who were willing to put their lives on the line to preserve our precious freedom. After the war, when I got home, I met and later married a wonderful lady, like your mother. And I have been truly blessed. We were married 50 years last April 24th. We have 3 lovely daughters and 2 grandchildren. I have been a farmer for 50 years. And with God's help, I am still farming. Last June, I attended the 53rd reunion of my old ship. So many of my wonderful friends and old shipmates now dwell in the house of the Lord forever. As each one takes leave, they seem to take a piece of me with them.
Mary Beth Markaway Reiki, the daughter of Mr. Markaway, wanted to share a war story involving her father, which later led to a reunion.
He was driving his ambulance on the beautiful hillsides of rural Italy when suddenly bombers and machine gunners appeared overhead. He took cover in the only place he could find, a church under the altar stone. He waited there for several hours until the bombing and machine gunning subsided. He felt it safe to come out and radio his captain, Merritt All. In fact, my father still has a photograph of his ambulance, covered in hundreds of bullet holes. To All, he said, "Sir, I'm stranded. All tires on my ambulance shot out. Need 4 new tires." A few hours later, a shining-faced private arrived, Freddie St. John, with 4 new tires. Mother told me this story recently. She was at home in the house that Dad had built for them when there was a knock at the door. It was an older gentleman from Georgia. It was Freddie St. John looking for my dad, Mark. "Well, he's not here," Mom said. "He's gone to the bowling alley to play cards with friends." So Mr. St. John got directions, went to the bowling alley, walked in, saw my dad, and said, "Who are you?" Well, my father, not quite recognizing him, didn't give his real name. "You're Mark." "Well, who are you?" asked my dad. "I'm Freddie St. John." They hadn't seen each other since that day so long ago, when as young men, on a war-torn hillside in Italy, 56 years before, my father needed 4 new tires for his ambulance, and a deep, deep bond of human gratitude and glory was formed.
Mary Kay Duckworth, Markaway's sister, picked up the narrative in her letter about the 109th Medical Battalion of the 34th Infantry Division.
What really impressed me was his close relationship with his fellow soldiers. In a medical company made up mostly of National Guard members from Iowa. The group of farm boys soon made and have maintained lifetime connections. Throughout the war, his letters to us were a running commentary on the incidental daily happenings, often mentioning my name, his good friends. Thus, they became our acquaintances also. Having experienced the war together, it is a blessing for these men to have a warm and close relationship today. I experienced this on a trip through Iowa in the fall of 1998 with him and his wife. We had wonderful meals and good visits with his wartime friends in their homes and in local cafes. These appointments were set up the night before by telephone as we traveled the highways and byways of Iowa. Usually the men gathered together, perhaps to reminisce, while the ladies became reacquainted. These visits had gone on over the years. We toured home sites, witnessed their various hobbies and interests, shared family news, important and not so important news, good conversations. I have never met more quality-minded, personable individuals, now in their 80s.
Juanita Yates of Monroe City, Missouri, lived happily with her husband's other love, his time in the U.S. Navy.
My husband, George A. Yates, petty officer, first-class cook, served in the Navy 4½ years and spent 3½ years on the destroyer, the USS Badger, most of it in the North Atlantic, protecting supply ships headed to Allied troops. He died September 18, 1997, and I lived with the love of his life, the U.S. Navy, as my only competitor for his affections for 52 years. The 11 children, 36 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren were raised to swab the deck, fore and aft, bulkhead to bulkhead, and we always ate in the galley rather than the kitchen. Sound familiar? They knew his stories by heart, and he was always ready for another telling. George died of congestive heart failure and was on a heart pump. Yet, we had the privilege of caring for him at home the last 6 months of his life. A farmer and salesman of farm machinery, he literally worked the day he died from his bed. Some man called that morning with something wrong with his machine, and George told him how to fix it over the phone. So weak he could hardly talk. He handed the phone to me and said, "I knew I could still do it." A few hours later, he was gone. Yet what a privilege we had. Constantly surrounded by family, he would tell his Navy stories to yet the 3rd generation on any occasion. At 4 a.m., the family was still there when he breathed his last. We got to say our goodbyes, listen to his advice whether we wanted or not, and hear him say how much he loved us all. It was so much easier than in his early years because he was so tired and worked so hard, and the emotion was buried so deep. He was a deeply religious man and grateful to his God that his life had been spared. Those last 8 hours, full of prayer, tears, and lots of laughter. Oh, how he loved to laugh. You, George, and they truly were the greatest generation.
Joe DiMaggio of Albuquerque, New Mexico, described how he and his wife were married and included a poem one of his children wrote for their 50th wedding anniversary.
December 7th,
1941, took my girlfriend to the movies for her birthday. We were faced with the truth. When the picture stopped, the lights came on, and the theater manager announced that all military personnel were to report to their commands immediately. When we stepped outside the theater, the newspaper boys were telling the story about the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. We've been dating for about a year and a half, and looking forward to a married life together. However, I knew I was being drafted, and did not wish for my wife to become a widow. We remained engaged. 2 months later, February 6, 1942, I was assigned to Camp Upton, Long Island, New York, and then to Fort McClellan, Alabama, for basic infantry training. When the war was ending in Europe, our battalion was stationed near Kassel, awaiting orders for the possibility of returning home after 39 months of overseas duty. Instead, our battalion commander informed us that our next move would be to the Pacific. I immediately wrote to my fiancée. This all turned out to wait for my return, because I was afraid I would not survive such a mission. Back to the A-bomb, our battalion was ordered to the coast of France for demobilization. I was discharged October 11th, and Ann and I were married November 11th, Armistice Day. We've been married 53 years and have been blessed with 2 children and 3 grandchildren, of whom we are very proud. On our 50th anniversary, which was attended by about 75 people, mostly family and friends from across the nation, we were presented with the enclosed. Now we are one, written by our son Paul. I was then asked to read it out loud so everyone could hear. I was doing fine up until the last paragraph, when the lump in my throat made me choke. Their parents came from foreign lands in search of the dream. They were to work at an early age, but also to learn and be the best they could. Their papas and mamas taught them to be as one. They played with cans, sticks, and rocks. Whatever the imagination could fabricate for fun. They met at work and enjoyed friendship while earning their way as their parents had done. The war disrupted their fun. With duty, honor, and love of country, one of them would fight the war on foreign soil, with his life on the line for a future. One would work in the factories at home and pray for him to return there. They were apart, but now they were one. 50 years of their life together, with all its meaning, brings us here to celebrate how 2 became 1. Learn life's lesson. Never forget how you came to this time and place. You are who you are because they are one.
Harold Duquette of Neshota, Wisconsin, described how he felt after being thanked by a Vietnam veteran at a recent Memorial Day parade.
I'm 76 years old and a veteran of the European Theater of Operations. Went to Omaha Beach on the 14th of July, 1944, when the Germans were just 6 miles behind the lines. Last week, my wife and I attended a Memorial Day service in a small town in Wisconsin. And as was my custom, I wore my Eisenhower jacket, which I can get on, but can't button. With my T5 rating on the sleeve, along with 4 gold bars for 2 years overseas. The ribbons I picked up along the way, and my overseas cap. I stood at the right times, and I saluted at the right times. As we were getting up to leave, an officer from the Vietnam conflict who'd been up on the band shell as one of the speakers came up to me and said, "I saw you in your uniform, and I just wanted to say thank you." It wasn't until later that day that I realized he hadn't said, "Thank you for coming to the ceremony," or "Thank you for being here." He just said, "Thank you." As I approach the 55th anniversary of Nona Shore in France, I must say, this is the first time that anyone ever said thank you for what we just assumed was our duty and obligation.
Linda Matthews of Doylestown, Pennsylvania, learned lessons of life and death from her father's experiences as a Marine Sergeant.
My father, Walter Ciselka, was a Marine in the Pacific campaign, and through the years, prompted by his reminiscences, I have striven to learn as much as possible about the Pacific and European campaigns. To discuss this with my peers, however, has been a bit of a disappointment to me, as I've found many in my generation have a general sense of apathy regarding this period in our history and the experiences of their parents. As for my father, he passed away 10 years ago. The doctors told him he had inoperable lung cancer and only 6 months to live. He never discussed his illness, nor did he ever complain about his pain. He worked at his electrical business until 2 months prior to his death, which was 3 years after they gave him 6 months to live. I will always remember his strength. And the one thing he told me before his death, he was in the second wave at Iwo Jima, and mortar shells were hitting his unit. So he jumped into a trench with 4 other Marines. A shell hit the trench, and he was the only one to walk out alive. The way he viewed it, he could not complain about his impending death because he'd been given 45 years he should not have had. I'm sure there are many such stories of the common soldier who did not go into politics or take advantage of the GI Bill and start major lucrative businesses. My father was a product of the Depression, with both parents deceased before he was 14 and with only a 9th grade education. His major contributions in life were to marry at 18, participate in a war, raise 2 children, and become a policeman and later an electrician. But above all, he loved and provided for his family. If there is to be a sequel to your book, you may want to consider dealing with the common soldier or grunt who did not achieve wealth or fame, but was just absorbed back into the population, making the best of what life doled out.
America, a nation of immigrants, had within its military force young men not long removed from the countries they were now expected to fight. Carol Lally of New York City wrote about her uncle, Armand Cassini, an Italian-American, and his friends.
They were architecture students at Cooper Union, and the friendships that they made there, along with others at Cooper, were lifelong. Uncle Armand served in Italy, in the Apennines, where his hand-drawn maps were used by the 10th Mountain Division. Armand and his friends always said they joined the 10th Mountain Division because they were excellent skiers and they wanted to enjoy the sport. I think they actually dropped out of airplanes on skis in the mountains. But Armand would never talk about such heroic adventures. Another thing that always struck me about the war is how many first-generation Americans were sent back to the countries from which their parents had just emigrated. They seemed to take it in stride, which I suspect would be very different for our more self-involved generation. I have a letter that Armand sent to my grandmother when he was stationed in Rome, updating her on family that was still living in the area. It had the casual tone of someone who was on vacation. Following the war, Armand joined and had a marvelous career with Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. He was a design chief on projects all over the world. And then he settled in the San Francisco office. Years later, he was up for partner when everyone realized that because he volunteered in his final year at Cooper Union, he did not have a degree. So, at the height of his career, he spent a semester in Berkeley. He enjoyed it enormously. No whining.
The American flag remains for many World War II veterans an almost sacred symbol of patriotism. They have been the primary promoters of a so far unsuccessful campaign to make desecration of the flag unconstitutional. Edward F. Jonat of Great Neck, New York, became a tireless promoter of the flag when he returned home from the war and joined the New York City Fire Department. His devotion to the flag has never wavered. Neither did his sense of right and wrong.
Like many of the people in your book, I found the war to be a great adventure. I found myself leaving New York City for the first time, seeing many parts of our beautiful country, and living with shipmates from many of our 48 states. That thrill I felt sailing out under the Golden Gate on a beautiful new submarine into the Pacific, China, and Yellow Seas. Every day was a new challenge, thrill, and experience. In the conning tower, I learned leadership from my captains that held me in good stead when I became an officer in the FDNY, the Fire Department of New York City. In 66 and 67, I was a chief in the 4th Division, Harlem, and facing a strange test. The children of Columbia University were rioting and burning our flag, and the NYPD asked us to open our hose and deck pipes on them. Boy, was I happy when I received the shortest and best directive I ever received from FDNY. It stated, FDNY fights fires, not people. At a Christmas party last year, I was again reminded of the impact that my love of our flag had on my career when, after 22 years in retirement, I met an old friend of mine. He greeted me by saying, Ed, Jonat, every time your name comes up, people remember the flag.
Walter Morris was a military pioneer as a result of World War II. He was responsible for the formation of the first unit of black paratroopers. Morris, now retired in Florida, was a sergeant in Fort Bragg, North Carolina with an all-black outfit. He remembers to this day the pressing effect of the worst kind of discrimination. While black soldiers were banned from using the post store, Italian and German prisoners of war who had been shipped to Fort Bragg were free to use the facility. In an interview with NBC News, Morris described how his men who had been relegated to guard duty reacted to this egregious policy and what he decided to do about it.
You automatically develop an inferiority complex. There must be something wrong with me if I can't ride in the front of the bus and the only thing I can think of is the color of my skin. And because I've gone to school, I mean, I put my pants on in the same way anyone else does. So it must be the color of my skin that causes this. And when you realize this, you're in a position where you're saying, what in the world can I do to overcome this? I saw the morale of my men at such a low ebb that they came off guard duty and would go straight into the barracks and sleep all day. They had no initiative, no motivation. So it occurred to me as the first sergeant of this company that I should do something about the low morale. And the idea came to me to imitate the white parachute students. Going through their calisthenics might be one way of uplifting our men. So we began every day at 4 in the afternoon. And when the white parachute students would march off the field, the black students would march on the field.
And what Morris didn't know at the time was that in Washington, black leaders such as A. Philip Randolph and Roy Wilkins were putting pressure on President Roosevelt to develop a black paratroop outfit. At Fort Bragg, the commanding officer called Morris in and told him he would be the first member of what would become a discrete unit, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion. Morris led a platoon of 16 fellow Negroes, that was the term that was used then, who had successfully completed their parachute training. The platoon came to be known as the Sweet 16. Morris still remembers their first jump.
Oh, a lot of butterflies, a lot of anxiety. You see, because the whole world had their eyes on us, and they were betting that we would not jump out of any airplane in flight. But we had to do it. And the worst looking jump I remember was our first jump. Because see, we were trained to jump with the proper attitude, which was knees together, slightly bent, feet together, and arms tightly held. But when I look back on that first jump, I just have to laugh because it was nothing like the training we had received. But it was improved by the time we got to our fourth jump. We were looking pretty good, just jumped out of the plane too fast. But we were soldiers now. Not just guard duty soldiers, servants, or cooks, but we were actually training for combat. And that gave us the only initiative we ever would need to succeed.
The Sweet 16 were ready for combat. They received some additional training in California, and they were sure they were headed to the Pacific and the closing days of the war against Japan. But instead, with no advance warning, they were sent to the Pacific Northwest as smoke jumpers to fight forest fires started by Japanese incendiary balloons. Morris was deeply disappointed. And as he prepared to make a jump into a fire in Washington State, he asked himself why he was doing this. And then he found the answer.
And it occurred to me that I was doing it for my children and my children's children, because I knew that I still had it in my heart that as great as this country is, that it would one day overcome the stigma of separation and past prejudices. And, we've come a long way since that 1945 era, and we have a long ways to go still. But I see a light. I'm 78 years old now, and I can see a light at the end of this tunnel.
Walter Morris has a special respect for General James Gavin, the scholarly and heroic commander of the 82nd Airborne. who led the Allied forces into Germany. When Gavin returned home and discovered the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion was a segregated outfit, he had it disbanded and folded into the 82nd Airborne. So when Morris and his fellow pioneers from the 555th hold reunions today, they always make sure they invite General Gavin's daughter. In 1946, Walter Morris left the Army and returned home to Seattle to learn his trade from his father, a bricklayer. He eventually took those skills to New York, where he became one of the first African Americans in the Bricklayers Union. He worked steadily on those New York construction projects until his retirement as superintendent of the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Project in 1983. He has a daughter who is a professor at Howard University. Another daughter is a health department worker. He has a grandchild in the U.S. Army. How does Walter Morris see his legacy as the first black military paratrooper?
We succeeded where we were not expected to succeed. And that we overcame the pitfalls and obstacles that were put there. We all overcame. And it's a warm feeling to know that the color of your skin has nothing to do with it, but rather it's your heart, your spirit of courageousness when it counts. And that should be a lesson to all of us. We should have, and we will have, a colorless society one day. And that will be the crown jewel in this great country's history.
Closing days of the 20th century and renewed interest in the World War II era prompted many veterans to revisit early impressions of life they described in letters home. Kay Voss, a retired businessman from Michigan, wrote the following.
Let me start by saying I am part of the World War II generation. I served in the 8th Air Force as a co-pilot on a B-17 flying 31 missions. We came home to forget the hell we'd been through, just wanted to get married, settle down, live like normal people. I arrived home on Labor Day 1945, started work at my old job at 8 a.m. the very next day. My father owned a grocery meat market at which I started work at the age of 12. He and Mother had a hard time when the war was on. Help was hard to find, rationing, customers sometimes hard to deal with because they didn't have what they wanted. They were more than happy to have me back. I remember those first 2 days. I was home. All those horrible days were behind me. I was still alive. Anyone would have to experience that to know how I really feel. Married a sweetheart shortly after, and raised 4 beautiful children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The war was behind me, far out of my mind as I could put it. It wasn't until my parents had both passed away that my old 8th Air Force days came back to me. In a box, all bundled neatly according to date, were all my letters home. My college days clear through my 3 years or so in service. Hundreds of them. The last of those letters expressed the euphoric joy and relief all servicemen and women must have felt in the summer of 1945. Hurrah, hurrah, I'm coming home. I may not be able to write again for a few days, so if my letters are rather scarce from now on for a while, you'll know why. I have lots to do and little time to do it. I haven't even started to pack. Everything's A-okay. All of us are so happy we can hardly keep our feet on the ground. I'm going to cut this short. Hope you'll forgive. See you real soon.
And here are some excerpts from a May 21st letter.
Our time is completely our own. We've been doing absolutely nothing. I'm putting on the weight I lost last winter when we were doing all the flying. My pants almost fit again. So I have quite a bankroll back there now, eh, Dad? Well, it's not nearly as big as it will be before I'm home again for good. There ought to be a nice little nest egg waiting for me. I don't know if I'll buy a plane or not. Right now, I have all the flying I want for a while. I'm going to be content to keep my feet on the solid ground. Right now, I have too many bad memories of things that have happened up there. Of course, civilian flying will be a lot different. I'll wait and see how I feel when I get home for good. And besides, I don't want to spend all my money on a plane. I've got to start thinking about settling down.
Kay Voss eventually took over his father's grocery business, and he continued in that line of work until his retirement in 1982. In his letter to me, he concluded with this passage.
I remember the chapel service before our first mission. The chaplain prayed for our safe return. And the last hymn, Be Still My Soul, returned to me many, many times in the trying days of combat. It seemed that someone was singing it over me. I like to think it was my mother. And she still does, from her heavenly choir. Be still, my soul, the Lord is on thy side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Leave to thy God to order and provide. In every change, he faithful will remain. Be still, my soul, thy best, thy heavenly friend, through thorny ways leads to a joyful end. Be still, my soul, thy God doth undertake to guide the future as he has the past. Thy hope, thy confidence, let nothing shake. All now mysterious shall be bright at last. Be still, my soul, the waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he dwelt below. Be still, my soul, the hour is hastening on, when we shall be forever with the Lord. When disappointment, grief, and fear are gone, sorrow forgot, love's purest joys restored. Be still, my soul, when change and tears are past. All safe and blessed, we shall meet at last.
I met Pat Zach in Louisville, Kentucky while signing copies of The Greatest Generation. She wanted to tell me about her father, Paul W. Tittle Sr.
My father served in the 537th Quartermaster Battalion of the United States Army. Among other battles and campaigns, he experienced Normandy firsthand. Apparently, his experiences there changed him forever. My father refused, or was unable, to talk about anything that happened to him or the things that he saw during the war. As children, we thought it would be exciting to think about he alone beat the Nazis and the Japanese. He never seemed to understand our childish fascination and would always grow quite serious and change the subject. When we were high schoolers looking for more insight into the history we studied, he would again become serious, only confirming or commenting on the facts. When asked for his personal reactions, he would only say, "Just pray you never lived during World War." In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, my father returned to Normandy. I was told that when he stepped onto Omaha Beach, and later Utah Beach, that he fell to the ground, shaking and sobbing like a child. And still, on his return, he would not discuss his reliving of that moment. I was born in 1950, a child during the years of rebuilding after the war, experienced adolescence throughout the turbulent 60s, established a career in the 70s, became a boomer, and began a family of my own in the 80s, and finally reached some level of maturity in the 90s. Throughout all those years, I never really knew or understood how my father became the great man that he was. But I did not know that he never wanted his children or future generations to experience what he did during the war. And he did all he could to ensure that the world, or at least our world, would be a better place. Throughout 16 years of formal education and hours of independent study, none of the U.S. history courses I took or books I read gave me the insight into the people who served in World War II as your book did. The stories told in The Greatest Generation, I believe, are my father's stories. Stories he could never bring himself to tell. Their missions, their goals, their dreams were his. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to finally get to know my father.
Alan A. Beaumont of Sun City Center, Florida, sent a copy of the inscription his grandson wrote inside The Greatest Generation.
I'm 78 years old and served in the Army Air Corps, the U.S. Air Corps, and the U.S. Air Force from 1939 to 1973, both active and reserve duty. I joined September 1939 as a private, and I retired September 1973 as a colonel. My grandsons have always had a keen interest in my services to the country. And I feel this particular note from my grandchildren show that there are still offspring, baby boomers, who realize the importance of World War II and the results thereof. Pop, Nini, they're going to Europe and Normandy. I think this book's title captures what we all feel about our grandparents. Thank you for giving us the world.
Gordon Morris of Lancaster, Texas, described how The Greatest Generation brought him closer to his father.
My dad began college with little idea of what he wanted to do in life. But when the war began, he enlisted and served in the Chinese army in Burma under the command of General Stilwell. And my dad, he never talked about the war, and I don't know if it was because of the horrors that he experienced or the belief that it was simply a job to be done and done without fanfare. He entered a career in the army, and despite the obvious drawbacks of moving around, we gained a respect for other cultures that we use today in dealing with others of diverse opinions.
And the following is part of a letter Gordon wrote to his dad.
Thank you for your hospitality during our visit. We had a great time, and we're glad for the opportunity to come spend time with you and Mother. I was especially glad to see how well you were able to get around and how much your health had improved. The enclosed book is a small gift to help us commemorate Father's Day. I wish we could be with you. Although I have not read the entire book, I have read segments. I've read segments and heard a great deal about it. It's Tom Brokaw's chronicle of the age of America's World War II vets, your generation. It focuses on the growing up and the silent sacrifice given by the men and women of the time. It is certainly a unique and important perspective my generation seems to have misplaced. I hope you enjoy reading it. I look forward to borrowing it. I look forward to borrowing it from you the next time we are home. I will celebrate my first Father's Day on Sunday, and I will think of you and your silent thanks for the direction and abilities you have passed on to me. I am, and I will continue to be, forever grateful.
been a deeply satisfying personal journey for me. Reading the letters, hearing the stories, sharing the emotional themes was a familial experience, intimate and nurturing. In this age of electronic communication overload, there's something reassuring and eloquent about a single voice speaking in direct, honest, and sometimes painful fashion about a passage when time was measured day by difficult day. In a time of conspicuous self-indulgence, it's comforting to be absorbed in the lives of others who are selfless and grateful for whatever they have. Even those who were unhappy with the oversights in the Greatest Generation made their points quietly and respectfully.